It was a crisp evening when billionaire Marcus Allen arrived at the prestigious Grandview Hotel, one of the most luxurious establishments in the country. With his impeccable suit and confident stride, Marcus looked every bit the part of a guest who deserved the best. He had booked a suite months in advance, eager to unwind after a long week of business meetings. But what was supposed to be a relaxing stay soon turned into an unexpected nightmare. The receptionist, a young woman with a polite smile, scanned his reservation and then paused. Her expression changed in an instant, the smile fading as she glanced nervously at her supervisor. Without a word, she handed Marcus a form, her fingers trembling slightly as she did so. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice shaking. "There seems to be a mistake. We can't accommodate you tonight." Confusion flickered across Marcus' face. "What do you mean? I have a reservation. It's confirmed." He pointed to the documents in her hand. But before he could say more, the supervisor approached, her presence cold and dismissive. She glanced at Marcus, then back at the receptionist, as if deciding whether or not to speak. "I'm afraid," the supervisor began, "we don't serve people like you." Those words struck Marcus like a blow to the chest. His mind raced. Asterisk people like you asterisk, what did that mean? His mind couldn't quite comprehend it at first. He had built an empire worth billions from the ground up, had shaken hands with world leaders, and was used to luxury at the highest levels. But here, in this moment, the very thing he thought was impossible, discrimination, had reared its ugly head. He tried to keep his composure, but the injustice burned deep. "What do you mean? Asterisk people like me asterisk?" he asked, his voice firm but controlled. The supervisor avoided eye contact and simply motioned to the door. "I'm sorry, sir. I cannot explain further. You'll need to leave." Marcus stood there for a moment, stunned. The audacity, the nerve of it, was unimaginable. He had dealt with rejection before, but never in such a blatant, degrading manner. As he turned and walked away, a sense of humiliation clouded his mind. But deep down, something else simmered, anger. Not the kind that would cause him to lash out, but the kind that would fuel his resolve. He knew he wouldn't let this injustice slide. Marcus Allen wasn't the kind of man to take defeat lying down. A sense of determination grew stronger within him with each passing second. He knew this wasn't the last time he'd walk through those doors. What had been done to him would not go unchallenged. His wealth, his influence, and his status gave him the power to make the system pay. He would return, not as a guest, but as the owner. Months went by, and Marcus silently worked behind the scenes. His contacts in the business world, his lawyers, and his team had begun to weave a plan. He knew he had the resources to make it happen. He was patient, carefully laying the groundwork for what would be the ultimate form of payback. It wasn't about revenge for the sake of revenge. No, it was about sending a message. About showing that no one, no institution, no person could deny him his rightful place in the world. And once he succeeded, it would be the ultimate redemption. Then one day, Marcus received a call. The Grandview Hotel was up for sale. The previous owner, a wealthy businessman, had decided to liquidate his assets, and the hotel was now on the market. This was the moment Marcus had been waiting for. He didn't waste a second. The negotiations were swift, and with a few strategic moves, Marcus made the purchase. He now owned the very hotel that had refused to serve him. It was a victory, but it wasn't complete. The real challenge lay in what would happen next. With his new title as the owner, Marcus was ready to walk into the hotel once again. But this time, it was on his terms. Would the staff recognize him as the man they had turned away, or would they greet him as the powerful force that had taken control of their world? Would the same people who had dismissed him now grovel at his feet, or would they try to maintain the same disdainful attitude? The real test was about to begin. Marcus had no intention of letting the past go. He would ensure that the history of this place was rewritten, but there was something that lingered in the air. As he made his way towards the Grandview once more, he wondered, just how far was he willing to go to claim the respect that had been denied to him? And what would happen when he returned, not as a guest, but as the new owner? The door to the grand view opened, and the silence was deafening. The tension was palpable, and Marcus could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him. What would unfold next? Only time would tell. Stay tuned, because what happens next will change everything. Marcus stepped out of the sleek black car, the same one that had carried him from one high-stakes business meeting to another for years. His shoes clicked on the pavement as he walked towards the entrance of the Grandview Hotel, the cold night air cutting through the stillness. He had been here before, on that fateful night when the world had seemed to crumble around him. But this time, everything was different. The building loomed above him, majestic and silent, as if it had been waiting for him to return. The hotel, with its towering facade and gleaming windows, had been the pinnacle of luxury and exclusivity for decades. It was a symbol of wealth, power, and status, frequented by politicians, celebrities, and businessmen from around the world. It was a place where people went to be seen, where the finest of the finest stayed. But to Marcus, it was now a symbol of rejection. That night, when the doors had closed in his face, had marked the beginning of a personal vendetta. It was no longer just a hotel, it was a battleground, a place where he would prove to the world and to himself that no one could shut him out. The memories of that evening flooded back as he approached the entrance. He could almost hear the words of the receptionist, the cold dismissal in her voice. Asterisk people like you. Asterisk, the words echoed in his mind, as if they were still hanging in the air. He had never felt such a deep sense of injustice in his life. But now, as the owner of the very place that had humiliated him, Marcus had a chance to rewrite history. He could walk in there, not as an outsider, but as the man in charge. But the question that lingered in his mind was how the staff would react. He had bought the hotel, yes, but could he truly erase the stigma of that night? Would the same people who had turned him away still be working there? And if so, would they remember him? Would they show him the same disdain, or would they bow before him, now that he held the power? As Marcus approached the entrance, the automatic doors slid open with a soft hum. The lobby was exactly as he remembered it, with its gleaming marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and walls lined with expensive artwork. The reception desk stood at the far end of the room, and for a moment Marcus froze. He scanned the area, his eyes moving over the polished wood and glass, searching for the familiar faces of the staff. He didn't see the receptionist who had been there that night, nor the supervisor who had delivered the crushing blow. But he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, somewhere, just out of sight. The lobby was quiet, almost unnervingly so. It was late in the evening, and most guests had retired to their rooms. A few staff members moved quietly about, attending to last-minute details, but none seemed to take notice of Marcus. He walked to the reception desk, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. A young man, barely in his 20s, looked up from the computer screen. His expression was neutral, almost bored. "Good evening, sir," the young man greeted, his voice polite but impersonal. "How can I assist you?" Marcus studied him for a moment. He was young, probably new, and had no idea who he was. He wasn't sure whether to be relieved or disappointed, but there was something else nagging at him. The receptionist didn't recognize him. He had to remind himself that this wasn't a personal visit, it was a business matter now. He wasn't here to relive the past, but to take control of the future. "I'm the new owner," Marcus said, his voice firm and authoritative. "I'd like to speak with the general manager." The young man's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise passing over his face, before he quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Of course, sir. One moment, please." He picked up the phone and spoke in hushed tones. Marcus could only guess that he was informing someone about the new ownership. As Marcus waited, his mind wandered back to the day he had closed the deal. It had been quick, almost too quick. The previous owner, an aging businessman who had seen better days, had been eager to sell. The price had been high, but Marcus had known it was worth every penny, not just for the hotel itself, but for the message it would send. He wasn't just buying a building, he was buying respect, and he wasn't going to let anyone forget it. Moments later, a middle-aged man emerged from the back office. He had a well-groomed appearance and a confident air about him. His sharp suit and perfectly combed hair made it clear that he had been in the hospitality business for a long time. He extended a hand toward Marcus, his smile polite but strained, as if unsure how to react. "Mr. Allen, I presume?" the man asked, his voice steady. "I'm Michael Dawson, the general manager. Welcome to the Grandview Hotel." Marcus shook his hand firmly, maintaining eye contact. "Thank you," he replied. "I trust you're aware of the recent developments." Dawson's smile faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly recovered. "Yes, of course. We've been briefed about the ownership change. Is there anything specific you'd like to discuss, Mr. Allen?" Marcus studied the man's face carefully. He couldn't quite read him. Dawson's demeanor was too polished, too rehearsed. But Marcus could tell that beneath the surface there was tension. Maybe it was the sudden shift in power, or maybe it was the fact that someone like Marcus now owned the place. Whatever it was there, lingering in the air between them. "I'd like a full briefing on the staff, the operations, and any issues you've been facing," Marcus said, his tone businesslike. "I'm sure there's a lot I need to know, and I want to make sure that we start off on the right foot." Dawson nodded, his expression unreadable. "Of course, Mr. Allen. I'll have my team put together a report for you. We've been running smoothly for the most part, but there are always a few challenges." Marcus raised an eyebrow, sensing that there was more to the story than Dawson was letting on. What kind of challenges? Dawson hesitated for a moment, then glanced around the lobby, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. There are a few staff members who have strong feelings about the change in ownership. Some of them are a bit resistant to the idea of new leadership. Marcus' heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected resistance so soon. But then again, he hadn't expected the smooth transition either. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "I want to make one thing clear, Michael. I'm not here to play nice. This place is mine now, and I expect the staff to respect that. Understood?" Dawson swallowed, the weight of Marcus' words clearly settling in. "Understood, Mr. Allen." As Marcus walked away from the reception desk, the tension in the air thickened. There were still so many unanswered questions. What would the staff do once they learned who he was? How would they react to his presence, now that he was the man in charge? And more importantly, would they remember that night, his night of humiliation? The hotel was his, but the battle was far from over. As Marcus walked through the hotel's grand corridors, the weight of the situation pressed on him with every step. The grandeur of the lobby had not shifted. The marble floors still gleamed, the chandeliers still sparkled with opulence, and the artwork hanging on the walls seemed to mock him, with their frozen smiles and disinterested gazes. But none of it mattered now. What had once been a symbol of elite luxury and high society had turned into a battleground, a place where power, control, and revenge would play out. He had returned with a singular purpose, to reclaim what had been denied to him. That night, when the doors had closed in his face, had been a public humiliation he couldn't forget. The sting of those words, "people like you," had stayed with him, festering in the background of his mind as he worked tirelessly behind the scenes to buy this very hotel. Now, the past was back, and the question loomed large. How far would he go to erase it? How far would he go to show that no one could stop him, not even those who thought they were above him? He stepped into the back office of Michael Dawson, the general manager, and took a seat at the sleek, modern desk. The office was a reflection of the hotel itself, polished, expensive, and full of quiet power. As Dawson sat across from him, Marcus couldn't help but wonder what the man really thought. Was he nervous, afraid, or was he just doing his job, trying to keep the wheels of the hotel turning without making waves? Dawson cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable as he shuffled some papers. "Mr. Allen," he began, his voice strained, "I know you're eager to get up to speed. There's a lot to cover, of course. We've been going through some transitions ourselves with staff turnover, and he hesitated for a moment, as if deciding how to proceed. There have been some tensions among certain staff members. Dawson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Marcus's gaze. A handful of long-time employees, waitstaff, management, and a couple of the higher-level people. I'll admit there's a strong sense of loyalty to the former owner. It's complicated. Marcus could feel the tension building. He didn't like the idea of anyone working against him, especially not so soon after taking over. He had worked too hard for this moment to let a few stubborn employees spoil his plans. I want you to make it clear to them, he said, his voice colder than before, that this hotel is mine now. If they can't accept that, they'll be the ones who need to leave. Dawson nodded quickly. Of course, Mr. Allen. I'll handle it. But I have to warn you, some of them are very passionate about their positions here. They've been with the hotel for years, and I don't care about their loyalty to the old owner, Marcus interrupted, his tone sharp. They either work for me or they don't, but they won't get away with trying to sabotage me from the inside. Make sure they understand that. His words hung in the air like a challenge. Dawson remained silent, his face unreadable. Marcus couldn't tell whether the man was agreeing out of fear or out of his own desire to keep things running smoothly. But either way, it didn't matter. Marcus had made his point. The conversation shifted as Dawson went over the details of the hotel's daily operations, but Marcus wasn't really listening. His mind was racing, his thoughts clouded by the unresolved conflict. His eyes kept drifting to the door, as if expecting someone to walk in and confirm his suspicions. There was something bigger at play here, something deeper than just a few disgruntled employees. Something told him that the resistance he was facing wasn't just about the new ownership. It was about the deep-seated biases and power dynamics within the hotel itself. Later that night, after his meeting with Dawson had concluded, Marcus wandered the hallways of the Grandview Hotel. It was eerily quiet, the kind of stillness that only came when a storm was brewing. His footsteps echoed through the empty corridors, and he passed the grand staircase, the luxurious ballrooms, the private suites. Every inch of the hotel reminded him of what he had lost, and what he now had the power to take back. He stopped in front of the grand ballroom, peering through the glass doors. Inside, he saw a few staff members tidying up, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were trying to avoid making eye contact with the walls that seemed to hold their history. These were the same people who had been behind the scenes, who had worked under the old owner's thumb, who had turned him away. But now they were his employees, and their past actions would not be forgiven so easily. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this resistance, something hidden beneath the surface. The words, "people like you," still echoed in his mind, and he wondered if the issue was more than just his wealth or status. He couldn't help but think back to the old owner, the man who had run the hotel for decades. What if there was more to his departure than simply a business deal? What if the entire hotel had been built on a foundation of discrimination and bias, with long-standing allegiances that would not be broken so easily? The more Marcus thought about it, the more he realized that the hotel's problems went beyond just a few disgruntled employees. There was something systemic at play here, something that reached deeper than even he could understand. And if he was going to truly take control of this place, he would need to root out every last trace of the old regime. That would mean more than just firing a few staff members. It would mean uncovering the truth about how the Grandview Hotel had been run for all these years. As Marcus walked back down the corridor, a sense of unease settled over him. This wasn't just about proving a point anymore. This was about uncovering a hidden world, a world where the past held secrets that could either make or break him. And the deeper he dug, the more he realized that the stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. What he was about to uncover might change everything, about the hotel, about himself, and about the very nature of power itself. He stopped at the elevator and pressed the button, the soft ding of the doors opening sending a chill down his spine. This wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it was only the beginning. As Marcus stood in the elevator, Watching the numbers slowly descend, his mind raced. Each floor he passed was a reminder of the vast empire he now owned. The weight of it pressed against him, heavier with every passing second. He was playing a game, but the rules were unclear. The pieces were in motion, and the board had just shifted beneath his feet. What was he really up against? The rebellion inside his own hotel was starting to feel more like a war, and he wasn't sure who, if anyone, would be standing by the end of it. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Marcus stepped out onto the lower level, where the staff break room was located. He had requested a meeting with a few of the more senior employees, those who had been with the hotel for years. They had witnessed everything that had unfolded in the wake of the ownership change, and he was certain they knew more than they let on. If there were secrets buried beneath the polished surface of the Grandview, these people were the ones who could reveal them. As he walked down the corridor, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. It was a strange sensation, one that crawled under his skin. The lights in the hallway flickered just as he reached the door to the break room, and for a moment, everything felt still, unnaturally still. He took a breath, pushing aside the feeling of unease, and knocked sharply on the door. Inside, the staff members were scattered across the room, some sitting at tables, others pacing restlessly. They stopped talking the moment he entered, their eyes flicking to him in a mixture of curiosity and something else, fear, disdain. Marcus couldn't tell. He felt a wave of tension sweep through the room. This wasn't just a casual meeting. It felt more like an interrogation. And yet, Marcus had come here with a single goal: to uncover the truth, whatever it might be. "Good evening, everyone," Marcus said, his voice steady but cold. "I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to get results." He paused, scanning the room. "I want to know exactly what's been going on since the takeover. I'm sure you all have your opinions, but I'm more interested in the truth." A middle-aged woman, dressed in the hotel's uniform, glanced at her colleagues before speaking. "The truth." Her tone was skeptical, almost mocking. "What kind of truth are you looking for? That you bought the hotel? That you think you can just come in and take over?" Marcus narrowed his eyes, sensing a deeper undercurrent of frustration. "I'm looking for what's really been happening behind the scenes," he said, his voice cutting through the room. "There are whispers, resistance, discontent. I want names. I want to know what you're really up against." The woman's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You think you can control this place just because you own it? It's not that simple." Her voice dropped to a whisper, and she looked around nervously. "There's more at play here than you know." Marcus took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, as if deciding whether to say more. Finally, she spoke in a low voice, barely audible. "The hotel, it's built on something much darker than you realize. The former owner, he wasn't just a businessman. He had a lot of power, a lot of connections. There are people who still have a stake in this place, people who will do whatever it takes to protect it." The words sent a shiver down Marcus' spine. The former owner, the man who had always seemed so benign in his meetings, suddenly felt like a ghost hovering over the entire operation. What kind of power had he wielded? And who were these people who were still pulling the strings behind the scenes? Marcus realized that the hotel wasn't just a piece of real estate. It was a territory, a prize, and there were forces working against him that he hadn't even begun to understand. "Who are these people?" Marcus demanded, his tone sharp. "Who's trying to undermine me?" The woman shook her head, her eyes darting around the room again. "I can't say much more, but you need to be careful. You've got enemies here, hidden ones. People who won't let you take control without a fight." Marcus felt a chill spread through his chest. The gravity of her words sank in, but the puzzle pieces weren't falling into place. Who were these enemies? And why had they been so intent on keeping him out of the hotel? Was it just about the power of the Grandview, or was there something deeper, something tied to the very foundations of this place? Before he could press further, the door to the break room opened suddenly, and a tall, wiry man stepped inside. He had a stern expression on his face, and Marcus immediately recognized him as one of the senior managers from the hotel. His name was Richard, and his cold demeanor suggested he wasn't fond of Marcus. The tension in the room escalated as Richard made eye contact with the woman who had spoken before, and without saying a word, she quickly fell silent, avoiding his gaze. Richard crossed the room slowly, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "Is there something you need, Mr. Allen?" he asked, his voice laced with an air of authority that made it clear he wasn't interested in playing games. Marcus stood tall, trying to mask the unease building inside him. "I'm getting answers," he replied evenly, his gaze locked with Richard's. "You know something about the former owner's connections, don't you?" Richard's lips twitched in a barely perceptible smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean." The room grew colder. The other employees shifted uncomfortably, as if waiting for something to happen. Marcus could feel the walls closing in around him. He had come here to get answers, but now it seemed like everyone was playing a game of silence, withholding what they knew. "I'm not leaving until I get the truth," Marcus said firmly, his voice tinged with the rising pressure. "And I'll make sure every one of you knows what happens when people withhold information from me." The silence was deafening. Richard's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer to Marcus, his posture stiffening. "You think you can control us by fear," he said, his voice low but cutting. "That might have worked for the old owner, but it won't work here. This hotel has been a power base for a long time, and no one, not you, not anyone, can just waltz in and take it over without consequences." Marcus' heart raced. The stakes were higher than he had ever anticipated. This wasn't just about a few disgruntled employees or a clash of egos. This was something much deeper, something dangerous. He had known it instinctively when he bought the Grandview. But now, as the walls closed in and the truth remained just out of reach, Marcus realized that the fight for control was far from over. And just when he thought he couldn't feel the pressure any more than he already did, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. A voice he didn't recognize, but one that carried a weight he couldn't ignore. "You're not the only one with power here," the voice said, low and menacing. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Marcus, and now it's time to face the consequences." The room froze. Every pair of eyes turned toward the door, where a shadowed figure stood, half hidden in the darkness. The silence was deafening. Richard's eyes narrowed as he took a step closer to Marcus, his posture stiffening. "You think you can control us by fear," he said, his voice low but cutting. "That might have worked for the old owner, but it won't work here. This hotel has been a power base for a long time, and no one, not you, not anyone, can just waltz in and take it over without consequences." Marcus' heart raced. The stakes were higher than he had ever anticipated. This wasn't just about a few disgruntled employees or a clash of egos. This was something much deeper, something dangerous. He had known it instinctively when he bought the Grandview. But now, as the walls closed in and the truth remained just out of reach, Marcus realized that the fight for control was far from over. And just when he thought he couldn't feel the pressure any more than he already did, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. A voice he didn't recognize, but one that carried a weight he couldn't ignore. "You're not the only one with power here," the voice said, low and menacing. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest, Marcus, and now it's time to face the consequences." The room froze. Every pair of eyes turned toward the door, where a shadowed figure stood, half hidden in the darkness. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, the dim light revealing only the outlines of their silhouette. Marcus' heart skipped a beat. He couldn't tell whether this was another employee, another player in the game he had already found himself entangled in, or someone far more dangerous. The room was suddenly tense, the air thick with uncertainty. The figure spoke again, their voice sharp and commanding. "You think this is about ownership, Marcus? You think you can just waltz in here and claim what's been built, what's been established for years?" There was a long pause, the words hanging in the air like a challenge. "You've underestimated everything." Marcus' instincts screamed that this wasn't just another disgruntled employee or a threat from someone trying to keep their position. This was something far more serious. The voice carried an edge of authority that sent a shiver down his spine. Whoever this person was, there was someone who had been in control long before Marcus even stepped foot in the hotel. A few of the staff shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting nervously between Marcus and the mysterious figure. No one spoke, no one moved. The silence felt suffocating, broken only by the sound of Marcus' own breath, which had grown heavier in his chest. He wasn't used to feeling this exposed, this vulnerable. The figure finally stepped into the light, and Marcus' breath caught in his throat. It was a man he recognized instantly, though he hadn't seen him in years. Robert Westfield, the former owner's right-hand man. The one person who had always been by the former owner's side. The one who had controlled the hotel's most powerful operations behind the scenes. Marcus had thought he was out of the picture after the sale of the hotel, but now, standing in front of him, it was clear that he had never truly left. Westfield's cold, calculating eyes met Marcus with a hint of amusement. "You thought you could buy your way into power," he said, his tone mocking. "But you forgot one thing, Marcus. The Grandview Hotel isn't just a business. It's a legacy, a network, and you've just scratched the surface of something much bigger than you." Marcus could feel the weight of Westfield's words settling over him, threatening to crush him. His mind raced, but he couldn't quite piece everything together. Westfield's sudden appearance wasn't just a surprise, it was a game changer. This wasn't some simple power struggle between a new owner and disgruntled staff. This was about something far more dangerous. Westfield had been the mastermind behind so many of the hotel's operations, and Marcus had unknowingly walked right into his web. The room was still silent as the staff looked between the two men, caught in the tension. Marcus tried to steady his thoughts, to regain control of the situation, but everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Westfield had the upper hand, and Marcus was starting to realize just how little he understood about what he had really bought. This was more than just a fight for control. It was a battle for power on a scale he hadn't anticipated. "I suggest you walk away, Marcus," Westfield continued, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You've already caused enough disruption. Leave before you make things worse. This hotel isn't meant for people like you." The words stung, but Marcus refused to back down. He wasn't going to let anyone dictate his fate. Not now, not after everything he had been through to get here. But the stakes had changed. He wasn't just fighting for ownership anymore. He was fighting for survival. If Westfield had truly been pulling the strings all along, then Marcus had just become a pawn in a much larger game. "I don't care who you are," Marcus said, his voice steely. "This is my hotel now. You're not in control anymore." Westfield's smile was thin, almost predatory. "You don't get it, do you? You think you own the hotel, but you've only bought the shell. The heart of it, the connections, the power, the influence, it's still very much alive. And I control that heart." Marcus felt a jolt of realization. It wasn't just the hotel itself that was valuable. It was the network it was tied to, the people behind the scenes, the alliances that had been built over decades. Westfield wasn't just a former employee. He was a gatekeeper to an entire world that Marcus hadn't even begun to understand. For the first time, Marcus felt the full weight of the situation. He had thought that the purchase of the Grandview Hotel was the end of his journey, but it was clear now that it had only been the beginning. He had underestimated the power and the connections that ran through the veins of this hotel, and Westfield had been the one pulling them. He wasn't just an obstacle to Marcus' control. He was the key to everything Marcus had wanted, and possibly more than he could handle. The statement hit Marcus harder than anything else. Richard had been one of the people who had resisted him from the beginning, but now it seemed like he was aligning himself with Westfield. If Richard had been in cahoots with Westfield all along, then Marcus was truly alone in this fight. His sense of betrayal was almost overwhelming. Westfield smiled, savoring the moment. "You're not the first person to make this mistake, and you won't be the last. But you will regret thinking you could just take this place. The Grandview Hotel doesn't belong to you. It belongs to something much larger. Marcus felt the room closing in on him. His mind raced, trying to piece together the new pieces of the puzzle. What was Westfield talking about? What do you mean by larger? And how far would they go to keep control of the hotel? As Marcus looked around the room, he realized that the faces of the employees had changed. They weren't just people working under him. They were allies of Westfield, each one a piece of the puzzle he hadn't even known existed. And in that moment, he understood. This wasn't just a battle for a hotel. This was a war for power, a war that Marcus hadn't fully prepared for. The stakes were higher than he could have imagined, and the real battle was just beginning. The tension in the room was suffocating, the weight of every unspoken word hanging like a storm cloud ready to break. Marcus could feel his pulse quickening, every instinct telling him that the moment had arrived. This wasn't just about controlling the Grandview anymore. It was about survival, about fighting for something far more valuable than money, his freedom. Westfield's smile grew wider, as if he could taste victory. "You thought you could buy everything," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You can't buy loyalty. You can't buy power. You've made a grave mistake." Marcus stood his ground, though every nerve in his body screamed for him to retreat. He could feel his hands trembling, but he clenched them into fists, determined to stand tall. "Maybe I can't buy loyalty, but I can take control of what's mine. And the Grandview Hotel is mine." Westfield stepped forward, his figure looming over Marcus. "You're too late," he said coldly. "There's nothing you can do to undo what's already been done. The hotel, the network, it's all set in motion. You're just a pawn." Marcus was silent for a moment, the weight of Westfield's words sinking in. Was it really over? Was the fight for control already lost? But as he looked around the room, something shifted in him. He wasn't just fighting for power or the hotel anymore. He was fighting for respect, for his own sense of worth. He had worked too hard, fought too long to let someone like Westfield dictate his fate. Then, without warning, a sudden realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. The one thing Westfield didn't know, the one thing that could turn the tide, was Marcus' own leverage. In his briefcase, hidden beneath paperwork and contracts, was a clause in the original sale agreement that Marcus hadn't fully grasped until now. The hotel wasn't just a piece of property. It was entangled with financial interests and partnerships, and some of those interests were loyal to Marcus. His acquisition of the Grandview had been much more calculated than anyone had thought. Marcus took a deep breath, his voice now calm but firm. "You think you have control, Westfield, but you're wrong. I know about the clause, the one in the sale agreement you overlooked." He paused, watching the look of confusion flash across Westfield's face. "The hotel's ownership doesn't rest solely with the board. I've secured the rights to more than just this building. I've secured the network you think you control. You've underestimated me." Westfield's face hardened, and for a split second, Marcus thought he saw a flicker of panic behind the steely facade. Westfield hadn't expected this. He'd thought Marcus was just a naive billionaire, someone who had bought into a legacy without understanding the deeper game being played. But Marcus had done his homework. He had come prepared. Richard, who had been standing silently by Westfield's side, took a step back, his eyes flicking nervously. "What is he talking about?" he asked, his voice strained. Westfield clenched his fists, but he didn't respond immediately. He was calculating, trying to figure out a way to turn the situation around. But Marcus could see it. The cracks were starting to show. For the first time, it was Westfield who was out of control, not Marcus. "I'm not here to play your games anymore," Marcus said, his voice firm with finality. "The Grandview Hotel isn't just a symbol of your power. It's a new chapter, and it's mine." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Marcus wasn't sure what would happen next. Would Westfield fight back, or would he finally accept defeat? The silence stretched out like an eternity. Then, just as Marcus thought he had won, everything shifted in an instant. Westfield's eyes narrowed, and with a sudden, almost imperceptible nod, he signaled to someone in the corner of the room. The door to the break room slammed open with a force that made everyone jump, and in walked two men dressed in suits, their faces hard and unreadable. They were no one Marcus had seen before, but their presence was unmistakable. They were enforcers, professionals who didn't hesitate to get their hands dirty. "Don't be so quick to celebrate, Marcus," Westfield said with a smirk. "You're playing a game you don't fully understand, and now it's over." The two men stepped toward Marcus, their steps heavy, their eyes locked on him with a coldness that made his heart race. For a moment, Marcus felt the full weight of his situation bearing down on him. Had he been wrong? Had he underestimated how far Westfield was willing to go? Was it too late to back out? But then something unexpected happened. Richard, the senior manager who had been quietly standing by, suddenly stepped in between Marcus and the enforcers, holding up his hand as if to stop them. "No," Richard said sharply, his voice firm. "This isn't how it ends." Westfield's gaze shifted, his expression darkening. "What are you doing, Richard? Step aside." But Richard stood his ground. "I'm not doing this anymore. The game's over, Westfield. Marcus may have been a threat at first, but you've taken this too far. The network isn't just yours. It never was." Marcus was stunned. What was happening? Richard, the one person who had seemed loyal to Westfield, was turning on him. The room had gone from a battlefield to something entirely different, like watching a storm finally reach its peak and then, unexpectedly, start to dissipate. Richard turned to Marcus, his expression conflicted. "There's more to the story," he said quietly. "Westfield's not the only one who's been pulling strings. The hotel's ties go deeper than you know. But the people who really control it are starting to see what's happening. They're tired of this game, tired of being used as pawns." The room was in chaos now, the tension reaching its breaking point. Marcus could barely process the weight of what Richard was saying. Had Westfield been manipulating everyone all along? And was Richard's betrayal a sign that the power dynamic had shifted completely? Westfield was furious now, his face twisted with rage. "You don't understand, Richard. This isn't your decision to make." But Richard didn't back down. "Maybe it's not, but it's too late now." He turned to Marcus. "There's a new way forward, and it starts with you. You're in charge now, Marcus. The game's yours to win, if you're willing to play it." In that moment, Marcus realized what had just happened. The Grandview Hotel wasn't just a symbol of wealth or power. It was a battleground, and the people who truly controlled it weren't those in suits or behind closed doors. They were the ones who understood the true nature of the game. And now Marcus had not only secured the hotel, but he had also earned the respect of those who mattered most. As the enforcers backed away, defeated, and Westfield stormed out of the room, Marcus felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The battle wasn't over, but it had reached its turning point. And for the first time, Marcus understood something crucial. True power didn't come from owning a hotel. It came from understanding the people, the alliances, and the game itself. But as Marcus stood there, feeling the weight of his victory, one final twist emerged. Richard, who had been his ally in that moment, stepped closer, his face serious. "There's one more thing you need to know," he said quietly. "Westfield's not the only one with connections. You've been playing this game with the wrong rules. And now you have to face the consequences." Marcus' heart skipped a beat as the full weight of Richard's words hit him. The battle wasn't over yet. In fact, it was only just beginning. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Richard's words hit him like a thunderclap. He had thought that the storm was over, that he had emerged victorious. But now he wasn't so sure. He had spent so long fighting for control of the Grandview Hotel that he hadn't considered all the layers of power and intrigue at play. Now, Richard was implying there were even deeper connections, people who held influence that Marcus hadn't even begun to understand. And the realization made his stomach churn. Was he still just a pawn in a much bigger game? Richard's gaze softened, almost as if he recognized the turmoil in Marcus's eyes. "Look, Marcus," he said quietly, lowering his voice. "You've already won the hardest battle. You took on Westfield, and you outsmarted him. That's no small feat. But the truth is, the grand view isn't just about controlling the building. It's about the people, the history, and the ties that run deep. You'll need to navigate that carefully." Marcus took a deep breath, his thoughts beginning to clear. He had won. That much was certain. Westfield, the puppet master he had once feared, had been exposed as just another player in a much larger game. Marcus had shown he was capable of taking control and making bold moves. But now, Richard's words resonated with a deeper truth. Ownership wasn't enough. He needed to understand the power dynamics, the history of the grand view, and the people who truly mattered. "Who else is involved?" Marcus asked, his voice steady now, ready to face whatever came next. Richard hesitated for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "There's a group. Powerful individuals who've had a stake in the hotel for decades. They're not just investors, they're the ones who've been pulling the strings behind the scenes. Westfield may have thought he controlled things, but the truth is, the real power has always been held by those who understand the long game. And now that you're in charge, Marcus, you're in their sights." Marcus felt his pulse quicken again, but this time it wasn't fear, it was clarity. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for it. He had learned so much in the past few days, about power, about betrayal, and about what it truly meant to own something as complex and layered as the Grand View Hotel. It wasn't just about being the richest, the most influential. It was about respect, alliances, and understanding how far the roots of power ran. The doors to the room creaked open, and Marcus turned to find his team entering, their faces a mix of confusion and relief. It was clear that they had heard the commotion and were anxious to see what had transpired. When they saw Marcus standing there, calm and resolute, they seemed to relax. The battle for the Grand View was over, but the war, Marcus now realized, was just beginning. "Everything's under control," Marcus said, his voice firm, though there was still a hint of exhaustion in it. "We're not done yet, but we've taken the first step toward making this hotel ours." Richard nodded approvingly. "You've got the right mindset, Marcus. You'll need it. There are some powerful forces out there who won't let you take control of the Grand View without a fight. But if you're smart, if you understand how to play the game, you'll come out on top." Marcus didn't need to ask any more questions. He already knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face, and more people to outsmart. But the difference now was that he wasn't alone. He had earned the respect of those around him, his team, Richard, even the staff who had once doubted him. They saw him for what he was, a leader, a force to be reckoned with. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, negotiations, and strategic decisions. Marcus had to navigate the complex web of interests that surrounded the Grand View Hotel. But each challenge only made him stronger, more confident in his ability to make difficult choices and trust his instincts. He learned to lean on the relationships he had built, on the network of people who had come to see him as more than just a wealthy outsider. He was the future of the hotel now, and the future, as he had come to understand, was about more than just money. It was about connections, loyalty, and the ability to see the big picture. One morning, as Marcus stood in the Grand View's lobby, looking out of the bustling city beyond, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had made it through the storm. He had taken control, not just of the hotel, but of his destiny. The hotel was thriving, its future more secure than it had ever been. The past, with all its secrets and betrayals, had been put to rest. But as Marcus turned to walk toward his office, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the story wasn't over. There was still much to uncover, much to learn. He had defeated Westfield, but that didn't mean he was the only one with a stake in the hotel's future. The group Richard had mentioned, the powerful individuals who had been working behind the scenes, they were still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And in the distance, Marcus could almost feel the faint stirrings of something larger, a new chapter yet to be written, one where the stakes would be higher than ever before. For now, Marcus was ready. He had everything he needed: the Grandview Hotel, the respect of those who mattered, and the knowledge that power, in all its forms, was a game worth playing. But as he glanced out at the skyline, a final thought echoed in his mind. The battle may have ended, but the real fight was just beginning. The hotel wasn't just a place, it was a legacy, and Marcus knew that his place in it was far from secured. The journey ahead would test him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. But one thing was certain: he was no longer a man fighting for control. He was the man who had taken control. And that was just the beginning.